The last transmission came through at exactly 3:17 in the morning on February 9th, 1945, and it consisted of only 7 words in coded Morse that translated simply to "compromised destroying documents. God bless America." And then there was nothing but static and silence from the agent. The Office of Strategic Services had code-named Sparrow, and somewhere in the frozen heart of Nazi Germany, a young black woman named Josephine Washington vanished into the darkness of the Third Reich, never to be heard from again. She had been born in Harlem in 1922, a father who worked as a Pullman porter on the railroads and a mother who taught piano to the children of wealthy white families on the Upper East Side. And from the very beginning, Josephine had been different from the other children on her block because she had an ear for languages that bordered on the supernatural, and by the time she was 12 years old, she could speak fluent French, German, and Spanish, having learned them from the diverse immigrants who filled the tenements and shops of her neighborhood. Her father had traveled throughout Europe as a young man working on steamships before settling in New York, and he would tell Josephine stories about the cafes of Paris and the castles of Bavaria and the ancient streets of Madrid, and these stories planted a seed in her imagination that would grow into an obsession with the world beyond the borders of her segregated existence. And she would spend hours at the public library reading everything she could find about foreign lands and foreign peoples and foreign ways of thinking. But what happened next changed everything. Because in 1938, when Josephine was 18 years old, her father was killed in a railroad accident in Ohio, and her mother died of grief 6 months later, leaving Josephine alone in the world with nothing but her languages and her intelligence and her burning determination to make something of herself, despite the barriers that American society had placed before every black woman who dared to dream of more than domestic service. She worked her way through Howard University by cleaning offices at night and tutoring wealthy students in French during the day. And she graduated in 1942 with degrees in linguistics and European history, just as the United States was mobilizing for the greatest war in human history. And Josephine knew immediately that this was her chance to prove that she was more than what America had told her she could be, yet she never imagined this moment would reshape her destiny. Because while most black women who wanted to serve their country were funneled into nursing or clerical positions, Josephine's extraordinary language skills caught the attention of a recruiter from a shadowy new agency called the Office of Strategic Services, which was America's first organized intelligence operation. And this recruiter, a white woman named Elizabeth McDonald, saw in Josephine something that transcended the racist assumptions of the era, and she arranged for Josephine to be brought in for testing. The tests lasted 3 days and covered everything from psychological resilience to physical endurance to the ability to maintain a false identity under extreme pressure. And Josephine passed every single one with scores that astonished even the skeptical white male officers who were certain that a black woman could never operate effectively in Nazi Germany. And when the results were presented to OSS Director William Donovan himself, he made the unprecedented decision to approve Josephine for field agent training. The training took place at a secret facility in the Maryland countryside, where Josephine learned the dark arts of espionage, including how to pick locks and forge documents and send coded radio transmissions and kill a man silently with nothing but her bare hands. And she was the only black trainee and often the only woman in her cohorts, and she endured the casual racism and open hostility of some of her fellow trainees with a quiet dignity that masked the fury burning in her heart. And then something no one expected, because Josephine's trainers discovered that her dark skin, which they had assumed would be a liability, could actually be an asset in certain operations, and they developed a cover identity for her as a mixed race German woman from the former German colony of Comorin in Africa, whose father had been a colonial administrator and his mother had been a local woman, and this identity would allow her to move through German society as a curiosity rather than a threat. The cover story was elaborate and detailed, and Josephine spent months memorizing every aspect of her fictional life, including the names of streets in Dula, and the taste of plantains, and the sound of her supposed mother's voice, and she learned to speak German with the precise accent of someone who had been raised in a colonial household by German tutors. And by the time she was ready to deploy, she had become someone else entirely, a woman named Liesel Hoffmann, who had come to the fatherland to serve the Reich. Behind these ruins, a secret waited, because in the autumn of 1944, Josephine was inserted into Germany through a complicated route that took her through neutral Switzerland and into the chaos of the collapsing Third Reich, and her mission was to gather intelligence on the German rocket program at Peenemünde, where scientists were developing weapons that could change the course of the war, and she was to make contact with a network of anti-Nazi resistors who had been feeding information to the Allies since 1942. The Germany she entered was a nation in its death throes, with cities reduced to rubble by Allied bombing and soldiers being pulled from factories and schools to fight in hopeless last-stand battles in the Nazi regime had grown ever more paranoid and brutal as defeat became inevitable, executing anyone suspected of disloyalty, and Josephine moved through this nightmare landscape with the calm precision of someone who had accepted that she might never see home again. Her cover identity worked better than anyone had expected because the Germans were so consumed by their obsession with Jewish ancestry that they often failed to consider other forms of racial difference, and Josephine presented herself as a loyal daughter of the Reich returning to serve her fatherland in its hour of need, and she found work as a translator at a military communications center in Berlin, where she had access to information that would prove invaluable to the Allied war effort. What she discovered next would shake even her commanders, because within weeks of arriving in Berlin, Josephine had penetrated the inner circles of the German military communications network, and she was sending coded transmissions back to London, containing details about troop movements and defensive positions and the location of secret weapons facilities. And her intelligence contributed directly to the success of several Allied operations in the final months of the war. But the work was taking its toll, because every day Josephine had to smile at men who would have murdered her if they knew who she really was, and every night she had to send her transmissions while wondering if this would be the night. The Gestapo direction-finding trucks would triangulate her position, and she lived in a small apartment in a bombed-out section of Berlin where the rats were as numerous as the refugees, and she ate the same watery soup and black bread that the German civilians ate, and she waited for the end. Yet she never imagined this moment would reshape her destiny, because in January of 1945, Josephine received new orders that would push her deeper into danger than she had ever gone before, and the OSCS wanted her to travel to a small town in Bavaria where intelligence suggested the Germans were building an underground facility for some kind of advanced weapons research, and she was to gather whatever information she could and then return to her Berlin base. The journey took 4 days by train through a Germany that was being systematically destroyed by Allied bombers, and Josephine sat in crowded compartments, filled with wounded soldiers and evacuated civilians, and she listened to their conversations and gathered intelligence, even as she traveled, and she heard the fear in their voices and the dawning realization that the war was lost and that the 1,000-year Reich would be lucky to last another 1,000 days. The town was called Ebensee, and it was nestled in the Austrian Alps, in a landscape of breathtaking beauty that had been transformed into a hellscape by the Nazi war machine, and Josephine discovered that the underground facility was being built by slave laborers from a nearby concentration camp, and she saw things in those mountains that would haunt her for the rest of her life, things that confirmed everything she had ever believed about the evil she was fighting. And then something no one expected, because while Josephine was conducting her reconnaissance, she was recognized by a German officer who had served in the colonial administration in Cameroon before the First World War, and who knew that there had been no administrator named Hofmann and no daughter named Liesel, and he reported his suspicions to the local Gestapo, and within hours, Josephine found herself being hunted through the frozen forests of the Austrian Alps by men who would show her no mercy. The chase lasted 3 days and 2 nights through terrain that would have killed a lesser person, and Josephine used every skill she had learned in her training to evade her pursuers, and she slept in barns and ate snow and treated her own frostbitten feet with bandages torn from her underskirt. And she managed to reach a safe house in Salzburg where a member of the Austrian resistance gave her shelter and a radio and a chance to send one final transmission. But what happened next changed everything, because the safe house was not safe at all, and the resistance member who had given her shelter was a double agent who had been feeding information to the Gestapo for months, and Josephine realized too late that she had walked into a trap. And as the black Mercedes sedans pulled up outside the building, she had just enough time to destroy her code books and send that final 7-word transmission before the door was kicked in. The arrest was brutal and efficient, as Gestapo arrests always were. And Josephine was beaten and thrown into the back of a car and driven to a prison in Munich, where she was thrown into a cell and left alone with her injuries and her fear and her absolute determination to reveal nothing, no matter what they did to her. The interrogations lasted for weeks, and the Gestapo used every technique in their considerable arsenal to break this black American woman who had dared to infiltrate the Reich, and they wanted to know about her network and her contacts, and the codes she had used, and the information she had transmitted, and Josephine gave them nothing but lies and misdirection, and the occasional truth that was so outdated as to be useless. What she discovered next would shake even her commanders, because during her imprisonment, Josephine learned that she was not alone, and that there were other Allied agents being held in the same prison, and she managed to make contact with them through a system of taps and whispers, and she organized a resistance within the prison walls, sharing information and maintaining morale, and preparing for either rescue or death. Yet she never imagined this moment would reshape her destiny. Because on April 20th, 1945, just 10 days before Hitler's death, in his Berlin bunker, the Munich prison received orders to execute all Allied agents before the advancing American forces could liberate them and Josephine in 17. Other prisoners were loaded onto trucks and driven into the Bavarian forest where shallow graves had already been dug. The guards were young and nervous, and some of them were barely old enough to shave, and as they lined up the prisoners at the edge of the graves, Josephine began to sing, and she sang the battle hymn of the Republic in a voice that carried through the forest, and one by one the other prisoners joined her, and they faced their executioners with the words, "Mine eyes have seen the glory" on their lips. And then, something no one expected, because from the tree line came the sound of gunfire, and the guards began to fall, and American soldiers emerged from the forest, having tracked the convoy from the prison. And in the chaos that followed, most of the prisoners escaped into the woods, but Josephine was struck by a bullet as she ran, and she fell into one of the shallow graves that had been meant for her. The American soldiers found her there hours later when they returned to bury the dead, and at first they thought she was gone, but a young medic from Mississippi noticed that she was still breathing, and he carried her in his arms for 3 miles to a field hospital, where surgeons worked through the night to save her life. And when she finally opened her eyes 2 weeks later, the first thing she asked was, "Did we win?" The recovery took months, and the scars, both physical and psychological, would never fully heal, but Josephine Washington had survived, and when she was finally well enough to travel, she was flown back to the United States, where she expected to be welcomed as a hero, but instead she found a country that was not yet ready to acknowledge the sacrifices of its black citizens. Behind these ruins, a secret waited, because the OSS and its successor, the Central Intelligence Agency, classified every detail of Josephine's mission for reasons of national security, and she was forbidden from speaking about her service, and the medals she had earned were never publicly presented, and for decades she lived in quiet obscurity in a small apartment in Chicago, working as a high school French teacher and telling no one about the things she had done. The truth began to emerge only after her death in 1993, when a historian researching the OSS stumbled upon her file in the newly declassified archives. And what he found astonished him, because here was evidence of one of the most remarkable intelligence operations of the entire war, conducted by a black woman in the heart of Nazi Germany, and the story had been deliberately buried for nearly 50 years. The recognition came posthumously, as it so often does for heroes who do not fit the accepted narrative, and in 2008, the CIA officially acknowledged Josephine Washington's service, and her portrait was hung in the agency's headquarters in Langley, and a star was added to the memorial wall honoring intelligence officers who gave their lives in service to their country. Her great-niece accepted the intelligence star on her behalf at a ceremony attended by the Director of Central Intelligence and the Secretary of Defense, and she spoke about the aunt she had barely known, who had taught French at the local high school and who had never spoken about the war except to say that some things are too important to talk about. And today, if you visit the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C., you will find a small exhibit dedicated to Josephine Washington, including her forged German identity documents and the radio she used to send transmissions from occupied territory, and the bullet that was removed from her shoulder after a rescue. And these artifacts tell the story of a woman who gave everything for a country that refused to see her as equal. Because the truth is that the intelligence services have always relied on people who exist outside the mainstream, people whose very invisibility makes them perfect for the work of shadows. And Josephine Washington used the racism that had defined her life as a weapon against an enemy that was even more racist, and in doing so she proved that patriotism knows no color and that courage is not determined by the circumstances of one's birth. Her story reminds us that the official histories we are taught in school are always incomplete, and that behind every great victory are countless untold stories of sacrifice and courage, and that the people who truly shape history are often those whose names we will never know. So the next time you think about what it means to serve your country, remember Josephine Washington. Remember the girl from Harlem who learned German from her neighbors and who used that gift to help destroy the most evil regime in human history. And ask yourself, what would I be willing to sacrifice for something I believed in? And somewhere in the great beyond, Josephine Washington is finally at rest, knowing that her story has been told at last, and that the sacrifice she made in the frozen forests of Bavaria was not in vain, because she proved once and for all that the strength of a nation lies not in the purity of its blood, but in the courage of its heart. Her grave in Chicago is simple and unadorned, with only her name and her dates, and a small American flag that someone always seems to replace when it grows tattered and worn, and sometimes visitors leave flowers or coins or notes thanking her for her service, and these small tributes are perhaps the most fitting memorial to a woman who spent her life in the shadows. Because in the end, Josephine Washington did not disappear in Germany, and she did not vanish into the darkness of the Third Reich, and she came home to the country she loved, and she lived a quiet life, teaching children the language she had used to fight tyranny, and she died in her sleep at the age of 73, knowing that she had done her duty, even if the world would never know, and that is enough, because that has to be enough. And her story stands as a testament to all the invisible heroes whose names we will never know, but whose courage made our freedom possible, and we owe them everything.